general vibes are bad, I think.
The general vibes are that we're making an attempt. These are the general vibes.
Of course.
All right. I had planned, Dan, on starting this by being like, have you seen all of the new Warhammer models? But as soon as we started talking, we pretty much just already went over that.
We've covered it all.
Yeah. Anyway, new Lion. It's cool, folks.
Yeah.
You're in it here first. Oh, dear.
Still like Space Marines. I was just saying to Jack, maybe I'm going to reconsider doing 40k, and I was trying to work out what I've been thinking about is which army would I do, and I like, can I resist the allure of Space Marines? But I don't think I can. Like, if I ever go back to it,
follow through on your ideas from the Silvia Frederici, the thing that we took from Caliban and the Witch of making a heretical warband. I think you need to do that.
Okay. Yeah.
I saw some like novitiates on eBay, like a box that were like half built for like $10, and I put in a bid, and then immediately someone was like, no, I'll pay more than that. So I was just like, all right, never mind. But that would have been cool. Fucking the Sister Novitiates heretical army, that would have been very cool.
That's why I don't bid for things on eBay. I don't think I could take the defeat, you know.
I just give up. I just go, okay, whatever.
Okay, not for me.
Yeah, not for me. I tried.
Like, yeah, maybe I would just like enjoy the relief of not having to have the thing. Like,
yeah. Well, that's actually what I do. Because as soon as I bid on it, I'm like, I don't have $15 to spend on this shit. What the fuck am I doing? Okay, in much more important news, Dan, though, it was recently a holiday here in the Northern Hemisphere. And that holiday, I've officially decided on a day for it, Dan. It was Potato Day, which I've officially decided is the day after the equinox. When we officially get into spring, as soon as I can do it, I'm planting my first
this is the plant the potato. This isn't the day when you go to the allotments and then all of the sort of old boys at the allotment are debating whether it is or isn't too soon to plant the potatoes.
Listen, I get in way before them.
Okay. So you've decided there aren't going to be late frosts, and
if there are, what are you going to do? The potato will be fine. Just plant will die back a bit, but I'm getting mine in early.
So have you done that deed?
I've done half of my first earlies, and then I'm kind of stressing out because I was going to basically, God damn it, I made like a spreadsheet for the allotment this year, being like, first phase, this is what I'm doing. Second phase, this is what I'm doing. It's going to be all organized. And then I've just realized immediately that I don't have anywhere near enough beds. And so I've been hurriedly trying to like dig beds in corners of the allotment that like used to be walking paths. And like, so I'm getting there. I was going to plant the rest of them today, but we're recording this podcast. And then I was going to plant the rest of them tomorrow, but there's going to be a big storm. So, I'll get to it when I get to it.
Yeah, I think you probably should have just dug the entire allotment straight away. And
yeah, apologies to the People's Commissar of No-Till, Charles Dowding, but I have been digging. I'm very kind to the worms, though. I always pick them up and I plop them in my compost, and they go, "Thank you very much."
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, that's what I got going on,
good.
as well as 40 fucking broad bean plants. And I'm like, why did I do this? I need this room for potatoes, but it is what it is.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I thought the holiday you were going to reference was like the beginning of British Summertime Day, which is
daylight savings?
Yeah.
Okay. That was called British Summertime Day.
Oh, yeah. I think officially. Yeah.
All right. Well, we have daylight now, which I appreciate.
We do have daylight. Yeah. But it can't be daylight saving. We can't talk about this. We can't. But my general feeling is it can't be daylight savings if it gives us more sunlight, right? Presumably, the activity of going into a winter time ought to be the daylight savings period.
Oh, I see. I see what you're saying. Is it daylight? I'm a fucking idiot. I have no idea. Is it daylight savings time now?
I don't know. No. So
okay.
in the winter we're on Greenwich Mean Time, which is the official Greenwich Mean Time, and then in the summer we're Greenwich Mean Time +1, which is British Summertime. So
I see.
So I don't know.
What is the socialist line on daylight savings time? Are we pro daylight savings time or are we anti? Because I know there are a lot of people who are like anti daylight savings time. Is that any idea why?
I don't know. I think probably because it's a great frustration to people who live in countries where it doesn't have such a stark impact. But I feel like for us, at our degree of latitude, is that right? It does have quite a big impact, right?
Yeah. I look forward to it.
I think it's good.
Yeah. Okay. That's the line.
But I mean,
back home, I will say all of the people that I know,
California, it probably doesn't make much sense.
Exactly. All of the people I knew who were like anti-daylight savings time are coastal liberal elitists, Dan. So
Oh,
there you
okay,
go.
okay. We definitely don't want to be that.
No, we do not.
We
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Pro daylight savings time. Let us know if we're wrong. One thing people need to know about this podcast: our opinions are malleable.
And you don't even have to make any effort at changing them. We'll just do it ourselves. It's not you don't have to message us. You don't have to phone in. You don't have to email angrily. Just
Yeah,
ask us next
please
week,
don't
and
do
we'll
that.
probably have changed our mind. Maybe
Yeah.
just send us the appropriate left wing reading on daylight savings time.
Yeah, does E.P. Thompson talk about that when he gets? Probably not. That would be a weird thing for him to talk about. But yeah.
If there's a Weekly Worker article on it, we'll read it and then we'll agree with that. It's fine.
Mike McNair takes on daylight savings time in modern Britain. Yeah, there's an article. That would be funny.
Anyway.
Anyway, Dan, we're back. We, as our listeners should know, because we had an interview last time, we've read a full book, and
Right.
this one stressed me out because Dan and I were gonna read this book for last episode, and then it very quickly became apparent that that wasn't gonna happen, and we were like, we'll do an interview. We wanted to have this one done for a while, so we'll do it. This will give us time to read this book. And then I think both you and I have spent yesterday and today pretty much reading this book, which is par for the course, I think.
Yeah. And it gives us the best chance of accurately representing it.
Yeah.
It's sort of fresh in my mind if it isn't sort of like a sort of jumbled soup of ideas, or it's created a jumbled soup of ideas out of my brain. But I try and sort of compile those mushed components back together into having something sensible to say.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. We'll have takes. Actually, that's not true. We never have takes.
No.
So we'll just do our best at regurgitating. So in one of our streams or in one of our episodes, I think it was, I made the mistake of saying that this book, okay, we're reading Eric Foner's A Short History of Reconstruction. There it is. There's the buried lead. I made the mistake of saying that Eric Foner was friend of the show Philip Foner's son. What he actually is his nephew. But the reason I got confused is because he has a twin brother. Not Eric Foner, Philip Foner. He has a twin brother, and it's his twin brother's son. So I don't know why that would have confused me. They have different names, but still.
Okay, well, you misled me, Jack, and I feel aggrieved.
Yeah, why did we read this? Goddamn
I read this whole book thinking it was Philip Foner's son. Now I don't care anymore. All of the worth and value of it has disappeared.
Yeah, I will say, I was looking this guy up on Wikipedia, as you do, and he seems like a really, really good historian. I think he wrote a book about Lincoln that a lot of people have said is like excellent. And he wrote a much longer book about Reconstruction, presumably called Not a Short History of Reconstruction. We wanted to talk about Reconstruction for a while. We bandied around a little bit, maybe talking about Black Reconstruction in America, W.B. Du Bois. Then we realized that book's about almost 800 pages. And we realized that would take us a very long time to get through. So even though that's probably the authoritative text on it, we picked this one, and I really enjoyed it. I especially like the first bits where he's just kind of like hits you in the face of like everything you think about Reconstruction. It's not true, and here's why. And you kind of have to kill your heroes, your Lincolns and your whatnots and your radical Republicans to really understand what actually happened. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. It was a fresh take, I suppose, but also a eminently readable one, which is why we read it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I was reading through it, and I was realizing how this could be an abridged version of a much longer book, because although it's comprehensive, you do feel like it's sort of flying through things at the same time, which just speaks to the fact that there's so much to cover in this relatively short period of American history. A great deal happened, and I kept trying to keep up with the dates, and I was like, oh, this is only 6 months after this last thing, and it's comprehensively different circumstances that are going on. But yeah, as you say, it's it does a good job of steering clear of celebrating or vilifying any particular one person, and does a really good job of giving you an overview of the history. And it's a great synthesis of history with a huge amount of, I suppose, political economy underlying it. That's when I sort of got excited every time there was this glimpse of, okay, what is the political economy underlying this? What phase of America's transition into capitalism does this sort of represent, and how does this fit into the sort of broader history of America? And it's a monumental period, which no one would have denied, right? The American Revolution, everybody knows, is a serious period of American history. But this book does an excellent job of, I guess, portraying and doing justice to that.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I mean, as you say, like even in the American school system, you're taught that you spend like a week or two on Reconstruction in 11th grade U.S. history, and it is taught as this monumental period. But the way that it's taught is it's like, the typical like, oh, and then Lincoln died, and he had all of the perfect plans. And if only Lincoln hadn't died, then maybe things would have turned out differently. And they do give you the, like, in 1877 or whatever, when there was the just horribly corrupt election that marked more or less the official end of Reconstruction. You do get the kind of, in the American school system, the like, and this was a disaster. And, the black population took a huge step back after, from where it was in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, where there were all of these new horizons and all these different things. But it doesn't really get into why, and it doesn't, as you say, have any of that political economy. I think one thing that I've taken away from this, though, is that Reconstruction is an incredibly complicated topic. And although the one constant remains, this battle against labor and the subjugation of labor that needed to continue in the eyes of the planter aristocracy and even the Northern capitalists, right, against the black population, ex-slaves of America, it was also incredibly complicated. And, it didn't just differ from 1 year to 1 year or from a couple months to a couple months, as you're saying, but it also differed like state to state, and it also differed region in those states to region. And we'll try and get into a little bit of that about why it was all so complicated. But as you say, in these like 12 years from the end of the Civil War until 1877, an insane amount happened, and it's a really excellent lesson in political economy if you actually try and understand why these things happen the way that they did. It teaches you a lot of lessons, I'd say.
Yeah. What also shocked me was just how repetitive it all was. It was like so many things repeat over and over again. The same policies are returned to in different guises, and then the same groups have the same kind of reaction, and then Washington government has a similar reaction, and everything seems to go through these undulating phases through the whole thing. Yeah, a very repetitive period, I guess.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was thinking a lot about the Comnenal and about his 3 quick steps you can do to do historical materialism. And I'll read one paragraph quickly from the Reconstruction book that really made me think about it. That kind of gets to this central idea of where the core dynamic is between exploiter and exploited, right? So he says, like their counterparts in other societies, the American planter aristocracy believed that the South's prosperity and their own survival as a class depended, as one Georgia newspaper put it, on one single condition: the ability of the planter to command labor. And the conflict between former masters attempting to recreate a disciplined labor force and blacks seeking to infuse meaning into their freedom by carving out autonomy in every aspect of their lives profoundly affected the course of Reconstruction. So I think maybe that's a good place to start, because Comnenal kind of says one of the main things you need to do is find this core dynamic that is, quote unquote, like driving history, right? Like, where is the main point of surplus extraction? And in these Southern economies, and this was different than in the North, which is another thing that makes this complicated, it was this dynamic of obviously slavery, right? But then at the end of the war, you had these two forces who wanted to go in completely opposite directions, right? Like you had the slaves who were freed in this kind of monumental moment of opening of social horizons, where you went from literally being, a slave to now, wow, almost anything is possible. We, land reform, we can get land, we can be our own people, we can do this, we can, he spends a long time talking about the different mutual aid groups and the churches and the political groups that were started by these slaves, or ex-slaves, I should say. And then also you had this ex-planter aristocracy, and we'll get into why they didn't just disappear here in a moment. But you had this ex-planter class who wanted to continue the production of cotton, rice, sugar, all of these different things. And they needed to maintain control and command over a disciplined labor force. And that is the central dynamic. We'll get into, obviously, kind of different elements that get into the story, Republicans from the North, and as well as even the industrial proletariat burgeoning in the North. But that's kind of the core thing, at least to me. There's quite a bit more to it, but that is, I would say, the core dynamic.
I mean, that's definitely true. That's what kept ringing true to me throughout this. And when this whole sort of story ends, we end up in a place very similar to almost where it starts, except for the emancipation of the slaves is a success. The effort to by sort of like the survivors, the remnants of the southern planter class, and in some ways, a lot of northern investors who come in as well. Because what's striking initially, to sort of the first thing that I wanted to add to what you just said was the idea of the kind of general naivety of the sort of like northern Republicans or the sort of like northern authorities in Washington. And one of the things I was trying to pass throughout all of this was what was their intention? What was the purpose of the Civil War? Maybe it's sort of like diminishing a reading of it's a diminished reading of history just to look for one single cause and one single purpose. But if it was the desire by, or an underlying aspect of it was the desire from the North to abolish slavery and implement a sort of free labor system. What they envisaged as being the free labor system was really underlined by an incredible naivety on their part, partly because of what you say, whereby it totally overlooked what the freed slaves were going to want, which was not to continue to work on the land for the same masters that had now become employers, but rather to gain access to their own land and grow subsistence crops and be independent farmers, rather than to once again subjugate themselves to basically the same labor conditions under a slightly different guise. And it kind of, for me, in some ways, it kind of justified the use of the terminology like wage slavery, like, right? Like at this point in time, for these people, there wasn't a huge amount of difference between these two systems, and they desired for something different, and the rest of American society was going to conspire to prevent them from having that, which is a sort of tragic story of all of this.
This is not a very happy story. No. And I think you're absolutely right to point that out, that this, I would say that this is the slaves and ex-slaves were far and away the most radical class in American society at the time. We'll get into kind of like the strikes that outlined the end of Reconstruction in the North towards the end of, I think, this discussion. But I think it's important to take a step back maybe, and maybe we talk a little bit about the Emancipation Proclamation, because this is like the ultimate thank you, Abraham Lincoln. He was the enlightened person in the White House. And this is like the ultimate great man theory of history shit, right? You know, like this scrawny ass dude from Kentucky or wherever the fuck he's from. He was just, you know, this enlightened, totally not white supremacist guy. And he totally did this for like nice reasons. But I mean, even more progressive liberal interpretations of this period will tell you that he did it so that he could win the Civil War. Lincoln freed the slaves and did the Emancipation Proclamation, and then, you know, Congress did the 13th Amendment to officially free the slaves out of kind of like self-interest. But Foner here puts forward a much more compelling argument, one that seems much more clear to me, which is that the slaves forced him to. He was just dragged into the he was basically just like dragged into the sunlight of realizing, oh, we need to free the slaves because slavery is ending whether I want it to or not. Because the slaves are just, you know, the war has started and so many of them are just refusing to fucking be slaves anymore. And it was such a fascinating, really like, gave me quite a bit of hope and, you know, kind of, I don't know, really made me feel good to kind of see that like emancipation was brought about by the people who were enslaved, not by anybody from above, right? Because he makes the point that like, well, what happened on the plantations? A lot of the like white male Southern population went off to go fight and die in the war. And this left the plantations themselves relatively unsupervised, and also just like, you know, at a point where the slaves were kind of like, there had been a number of rebellions before where they were like, this is really our chance. So a lot of them would either take over the plantations or just fuck off and just go to the North and just be like, we're not going to do this anymore. So when we get this interpretation of history of like, Lincoln freed the slaves, thank you, Lincoln, it's like the slaves freed themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. And what was most shocking about particularly that period during the Civil War, I think he calls it like wartime Reconstruction, right? The sort of early phases. I think he says, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he says that the initial Emancipation Proclamation applied to the southern states, but didn't apply to slaves living in the sort of border regions that were occupied by the North, right? So it wasn't even a comprehensive emancipation. It was just one directed at the South. So even in its first instantiation, it was very clearly a sort of tactical move, not an ideological one, I suppose. I guess the other thing to highlight about Lincoln in this book are sort of like the generally not messianic exactly, but like the sort of lost alternate history version where Lincoln survives, is that Lincoln is the great support, supposedly like the great supporter of the enfranchisement of freed slaves, and with his death that becomes a much more contested political battle, I suppose. But once again, I think that interpretation, as you say, is one which is attaching far too much significance to one great person, particularly as he'd only sort of gradually moved toward that through political pragmatism and not, again, some sort of great ideological drive.
Yeah, and like every speech that he cites, it's always Lincoln being like, I would be maybe in favor of something like this. And it's just like, oh my God, this asshole. Because he's trying to balance, right, like the support of the Democrats in the border states who stayed loyal to the Union, right? Andrew Johnson types, with the radical Republicans, right? The radical Republicans. These were like the people who were like, maybe no slavery actually, and maybe we should like actually punish these Southerners. But I think, yeah, maybe let's get back into that idea you were talking about, the whole free labor ideology, because this really underscores, as you say, the like complete naivety of the Republicans. And, you know, during presidential Reconstruction, as well as during congressional Reconstruction, right? Like this idea that they could just open everything up to the free market or whatever, and the slaves would, I don't know, they kind of thought that they were doing something good to the slaves by doing that, because they just assumed, typical liberal ideology, they assumed everybody was on a similar level and a power dynamic wise, and also everybody was on a similar economic level, and there was no real such thing as class. So it's like, oh, if we just open these people up, the hardest working among the freed slaves will be able to lift themselves up by the bootstraps. But it's like, first of all, the ex-plantation owner class was never ever going to allow that to happen. And also, like, this is just not the way anything works, right? Like, he gives the example of one of the field orders that Sherman issued on his march to the South, right? Through the South, where he basically just like, you know, destroyed whole swaths of where he marched and eventually made it to the ocean. Something that kind of like began to herald the end of the Civil War. One of the field orders he issued was um, basically a type of land reform where he did actually give the freed slaves in his wake something like 40 acres. It was the 40 acres and a mule thing, right? It was like, give them this land that we've taken from the plantation owners and the aristocracy, give it to the slaves, let them work it, let them make it good, because this is what they want, and this is what would be good for the South. This would allow us to get back to cotton production and sugar production, but it would do it in a way where everybody's basically happy. Everybody other than the ex-plantation owner class, because inevitably, as Reconstruction ground on, this land was taken away from the slaves and given back to, as I think one freed slave says, the exact people that kept us in chains, you know? So again, this idea of the free labor ideology, it just, of course, it was never going to work.
Yeah. I think the other, well, there's a few aspects of the free labor ideology that sort of you have to compile as you read this book, and you find different elements of it. One of them is what there's a naivety, as we've said, on a sort of total lack of understanding as to what the slaves are actually going to want to do. And as you sort of hint at, there's also a general naivety around what is possible. And I think there's also a naivety around actually how capitalism works and how it's going to play out. There is this idea, it's almost one of the other hallmarks of this whole period, this book and this whole period of history, it's the constant changing class relations and the various factions and formations within the classes, but also the actual evolution of new classes and the disappearance of old class relations, and subsequently also the evolution of new political forms of representation for those classes as well. So you get these massive political transformations as you also got these massive class transformations, and they're happening in the North with the bourgeoisie and the working class, and obviously in the South as well. But early on, there's this idea that one of the aspects of the free labor ideology is that if we make these people free and they'll work for wages, there can be this new sort of like harmonious existence between the classes, which is sort of what you applied, sort of like acknowledged before, right? Was like there wouldn't be any class conflict. There would be harmonious existence. And the other really naive aspect of the free labor ideology that seemed to occupy the minds of lots of Northern radicals and Northern Republicans, and Southern Republicans as well, was this idea that working for a wage was a transitionary step toward building enough of a pot of money to gain your own land, and then it's through that channel that the emancipated slaves would find their way to being owning land and being subsistence farmers or being capitalist farmers or what have you, which was, I guess, the ultimate desire was not for them to be tenant farmers, not for them to be subsistence, but to actually like do capitalist agriculture. But of course, the general trend of capitalism and the trend of this book is actually the opposite. It's like people engaging into the capitalist system and finding themselves prohibited from advancement and actually falling back into poverty and into indebtedness. And that doesn't just apply to the freed black slaves. It also applies to sort of white subsistence farmers that existed at this period of time in sort of like lots of the northern parts of all of these states weren't really, their economies weren't dominated by the plantation or by sort of a predominantly slave workforce, but were lots of small white subsistence farmers. And a similar process happened to them, right? Like this engagement with the market and engagement with capitalism dragged all of the poor into greater and greater degrees of poverty without any possibility for them pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, as this sort of free labor ideology implied that they ought to be able to do.
We have our chosen short king of the podcast in Louis Blanc. I would like to put forward, Dan, that we have our chosen short devil of the podcast, which is Andrew Johnson. Because obviously after, to kind of go off of what you're saying, obviously after Lincoln was assassinated, we get Johnson becoming the president. And he was a bit of a slippery fish at first. Everyone was kind of like, well, he seems progressive for a Democrat. Well, you know, he's making all of these promises. But what does that actually mean? And he's kind of had done a few things to kind of piss off some of the like Southern plantation owner aristocracy. So people are like, what is he actually going to do? So the kind of radical Republicans at least held their breath a little bit. They're like, well, maybe he isn't just going to be a Democrat, like horrible guy. And of course he wound up being a Democrat, horrible guy. But the thing that I thought was interesting was that he kind of pegged all of his hopes on raising the white yeomanry, as you're kind of saying, out of poverty and being like, listen, this is the way that we supplant the plantation owners, is we try and pull up these like, you know, border state white yeoman people who kind of were maybe unionists somewhat in their sympathies, but also kind of just wanted to not just be sharecroppers anymore. Maybe if we can economically raise these people up, everything will be fine. And that wound up just being a disaster and a horrible mistake, because the policies that he attempted to put forward to raise this yeomanry up, all it wound up doing was just bringing the plantation owner class right back. And it's this interesting, like, weird dynamic where you're still dealing with, I'm not going to say like feudal class relations, but you're certainly dealing with something that you wouldn't necessarily call specifically just obviously capitalist. There's not too much in this book about whether or not the American like slave owning South was capitalist. That discussion doesn't really come up, but it's an interesting approach where you're not just dealing with wage laborers. And you get to this point where some of the black freed slaves kind of rather, they kind of fell into sharecropping because they didn't really want to just become wage slaves. Like, the one thing that the ex-slaves really wanted was to create a world on their own that was outside of this horrible, like, overbearing plantation system. And so sharecropping at least offered them a place where they could at least get a little bit of theirs and have something that's theirs. And really, you know, it's just mine. I can just have that. Wow. And I can maybe eke out like a living in the world just for me. Whereas wage slavery basically just promised going right back to, you know, well, it's literally the same boss, but now, you know, you're technically not a slave. But then there were the black codes. So it's like you kind of still were, you know.
And it's really interesting how the desire how there was a general misconception around what that meant for both parties, like that desire for the freed slaves to the desire to determine their own course, I suppose, and to have their own part. And in some ways, the case they were making quite rightly was that they put so much work into maintaining these plantations over so much time that what they were owed was some share of what they'd worked toward building. But what's really interesting is the conflict between how the planter class, how the landowners feel about that relationship of the sharecropper, and how the tenant farmers in that instance feel about it, because they wanted to be able to maintain a certain degree of control over their labor. They wanted to know how much they were going to work and what times of the day and this kind of thing. And the planters really want to be able to control that aspect of the emancipated slaves' labor. And similarly, the slaves really wanted to think of their share of the crop that was being produced as theirs, not being something that belonged to the planter until it was given to them, kind of thing. So there were quite a lot of contradictions in this relationship, which are representative of the planter class's desire to turn them into full-fledged wage laborers, and the slaves' desire to resist that and maintain a greater degree of freedom than had existed, or some measure of freedom, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the thing that this book made me realize was that if the Republicans, and specifically Lincoln, ever really wanted to, eradicate the old slave owning aristocracy, eradicate slavery, and really move on to a different system, it would have come at the cost of waging a massive class war. And I don't think that was really in the Republicans' interest. I don't think it was in the burgeoning industrial capitalist class's interest. One thing that we'll see as we kind of go on is that the carpetbaggers, the Republicans and all of these different types, what it very quickly became clear that their aim wasn't, first of all, to set the ex-slaves on their feet. It was very quickly to find opportunities for investment, and this labor force offered an opportunity for that. And specifically, what a lot of them were looking to do was to open up the South to railroads. And this was a very interesting thing he kept hinting at, this idea of a lot of the Republicans just, working at the behest of people like Jay Gould and people like that, railroad barons. He kept hinting at this throughout the book, and then he eventually kind of talks about it at length towards the end about why railroads were so important. And I guess it was important to basically create internal markets that the South could, create manufacturing for. Obviously, just building the railroads offered a huge opportunity for investment. If you owned those railroads, that would be huge. And you really start to see this interesting dynamic once the Republicans finally get their way and they're able to build these railroads of seemingly at random, some towns being picked to become the big towns of the South that we know now. Atlanta or Macon, towns like that actually become big because they have the railroads going through them. And yeah, I don't know. I guess the reason I bring that up is, I guess, just because it shows what the Republicans' real aim was. And again, none of what we see as the real aims of Reconstruction, what they needed to be of, ending the reliance of the ex-slaves on this plantation owning class, et cetera, could have ever happened without a massive class war. And it just wasn't in the Republicans' interests. Even some of these so-called radical Republicans kind of balked at suffrage for the blacks freed slaves. So, that just shows you, I think, everything that you need to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things to say to that. One, what you're hinting back to there is this question of whether pre-Civil War, whether the pre-Civil War South was capitalist or not, and how this transition into capitalism, or this intersection with capitalism, or this deepening of the capitalist relations in the South happened. And I think in some ways, maybe I'd think about slavery economy of the plantation South as kind of externality that sort of Jason Moore talks about a bit, as something which is like a sort of cheap, which is not fully incorporated into the capitalist relations yet, but something which is exploited by capitalism, right? Because we know that the cotton growing South was incredibly integral to the capitalist center of cotton production in England. But yeah, this process of the introduction of railroads, and it does lead to this greater connection of various different centers in the South to a broader market, which I think is probably quite essential to that sort of development of capitalism. I spent a long time. I mean, I don't want to preempt too much of the end of this book. When I got to the end of it, I was just trying to work out how different the ending. We'll get there eventually. How different the ending point is to how whether there were ways that could have gotten to that point that were sort of less bloody and less circuitous, because it felt like it was very similar to what you could have had 10 years before, kind of thing. And I was trying to work out what had happened. And one of the things was that sort of greater exposure to the market that the South was now in a position to have to bear, which you're saying becomes from the introduction of railroads, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because I've always kind of rolled my eyes when people are like, they come down really hard on, no, the slave owning South wasn't capitalist. Of course it wasn't. And it's like, well, it very clearly played a really integral role, as you're saying, in the development of the textile industry, which we always think of as like the ultimate first capitalist industry in the world, right? In England, in Britain, I should say. So I think that's a really good point. It was this kind of appropriation, this kind of externality of a labor system that was eventually uh, engulfed into actual like capitalist relations. But that wouldn't happen for a really, really long time, well after the end of Reconstruction, quote unquote, in the late 1870s. I mean, sharecropping would be a thing, even in the West, for an incredibly long period of time. So I think that's really well said.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like the South was left with quite a sluggish economy after this whole process finished, without any sort of like strong dynamism toward capitalist growth as we would recognize it. There is an interesting aside to make connected to that is in this book. One of the things that struck me, because I'd always entered this perhaps with the idea that the North was capitalist and the South was something else, or was sort of like an adjunct, but wasn't fully incorporated into American capitalism. But when he does talk about Reconstruction in the South and in the North, rather, in later stages of this book, he also implies that there were considerable developments that happened to Northern capitalism in the Reconstruction phase in the North, which almost raised the question for me, well, was the North fully capitalist even in the outset of the Civil War? I mean, I don't know whether these are particularly vital questions. What was happening was there was an evolution toward capitalism, as there was happening at so many places in the world at different stages, and continues to happen. And it's not like turning on a switch. It's a gradual process. And later on, we can talk about what it was that was happening in the North that was so fundamental, because I think it's quite important to the story. But
Yeah.
sidetrack there.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple beats we should hit on, I
Yeah.
guess. We should hit on what wound up happening to Johnson.
Yeah, I don't, sorry, I kind of
Go
wanted
ahead.
to, like, it's such a strange character and such a different trajectory through this, because when you were talking about him earlier, I just wanted to sort of like bring up the one thing that I really remembered about him was like, because he had this attraction to the sort of like white yeomanry of the South and really wanted to champion them, and he was I think basically, like so many people in this that could potentially be, but seem to have like desires to liberate in some ways the slaves and give them a certain measure of rights. He was also fundamentally racist at his core, and the most one of the most telling, one of the most peculiar aspects of him that's discussed in this book is the degree to which he thought that the sort of like slaves had such a history of oppression by the planters, and that they were so meek and under their foot that they would ally with the planters if they were given any degree of political power. So one of his main motivations for like disenfranchising them of political power was to prevent some kind of allyship between the slaves and the former planter aristocracy in the South. But that sort of brings to mind one of the most interesting transitions. He's only a president for like 3 years or something, and one of the most interesting, weirdest transitions that he experiences is going from somebody who is actually fundamentally opposed to the planter aristocracy when he takes over the presidency, to basically spending all of the presidency actually reinforcing their position, not really prosecuting that planter class who'd been so significant to the secessionist movement, but rather desiring to re-empower them, reinstall them in place, I suppose. And it sort of makes me want to challenge, or not challenge exactly, query the degree to which they couldn't have gone after this class. As you say, it would have been a significant class war, I suppose. But Foner does kind of indicate that the South was cowed by its loss in the Civil War, that it really would have accepted a lot more being forced upon it by the North than the North was actually willing to do. And I do wonder whether they could have removed or significantly changed the social relations of the South. Sort of feel like that could have been a possibility, right? They could have followed through with the promise of breaking up the plantations and giving them as plots to the slaves, and then they could have presumably installed capitalism in a different means, or a more full-fledged version of capitalism through that method than they ended up doing, which actually brought them back to a very similar kind of economic model that they had at the end of the Civil War. But then that's kind of implying that their desire was to implement capitalism, which I don't know whether it necessarily was. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they didn't for a reason. Maybe I shouldn't say that. I mean, I think that what this was all about, though, was maintaining a disciplined labor force. And so maybe the Republicans just saw the planter class as the only people who could legitimately do that. Maybe that was it. Maybe it was just pure ineptitude. I mean, the Freedmen's Bureau was run so poorly and given so little money that the people who were running it were like, well, we're not going to be able to fucking do anything from like day one. But then also, like, maybe it would have just been incredibly politically unpopular for them to just out and out do land reform. Like land reform, yeah, I don't know. Very, very rarely in history a non-controversial topic. And this would have been like one of the biggest land reform things in history, right? If they were to just completely give the land over to the slaves. And I mean, you know, as much as we like to say the radical Republicans were like this monolithic bloc, like they certainly weren't. And there were a lot of different factions within the radical Republicans. This is one of the reasons it all falls apart towards the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. But like, I'm tempted to say that it was preferable for the Republicans to maintain a disciplined labor force than to maybe risk having a like utopian, you know, socialist, potentially like, you know, black state in the South.
Yeah, I think you are right. And I think it all actually comes back to what we identified before as the contradictory nature of this free labor ideology. Like both parties wanted to have a disciplined workforce that was primarily made up of the emancipated slaves continuing to work on the plantations or continuing to work in similar agricultural fields, growing export crops like cotton and sugar and rice and what have you. And it was just that the North naively believed that you could introduce wage labor mechanisms and a market in labor, and the emancipated slaves would accept that. And in some ways, actually, the former planter class had a much more clear-headed vision of what was going to have to be done to institute, as you say, that disciplining of labor. And they were doing it very quickly, almost immediately after the Civil War ended. They were trying to put in place mechanisms to prevent the freed slaves from actually moving freely, from leaving the land. They were trying to make it illegal for anybody to offer another job to any of the freed slaves, because they wanted to have them continue to be tied to one plot of land and one employer. They wanted to have them sign yearly contracts. They wanted to have them receive a yearly wage. So they were sort of implementing all of these things that flew in the face of the North's idea of what was implied by free labor. And it was, in some ways, it was the North's reaction to that which led to the ensuing kind of congressional or radical period of Reconstruction that basically stemmed from the North's inability to accept that to achieve what everybody wanted to achieve, maybe the planters were right in their efforts, I suppose. No,
Or I think that they existed. Like they were the only people who had the means at that moment to, you know, and this is fucking bullshit about like Andrew Johnson being like, okay, you can have your land back if you swear an oath. It's just like, oh my God. It's like these people just fought one of the bloodiest battles in history up until that point, or wars up until that point. And he's like, swear an oath. It's like, oh yeah, that means something. Like, please. So yeah, Johnson winds up getting impeached by the House and not by the Senate. And I would like to read you an incredibly funny bit from a Wikipedia page that I found. And Thaddeus Stevens, who's one of the like ultimate radical Republicans in this, and who I think comes across really well and as someone who really cares about enacting civil rights and equality, perhaps only because he dies relatively early on and isn't, you know, he doesn't have to deal with like the falling apart of the radical Republicans towards the end of Reconstruction. He Look up a photo of this guy, listeners, while I'm telling you about this, because this is incredible. Basically, he was one of the main people who wanted to get Johnson impeached. He kind of maneuvered Johnson into doing something where he was going to have to act in a way where he was going to like break the law. But he was also dying as all of this was going on. And so this passes, the setup to this is that this passes the House, he gets impeached, but then the Senate says no, right? And ostensibly it's like one vote that decided it, but Foner makes the point that like if it looked like it was going to come down to the wire any more than that, a bunch of other people would have voted to make it not happen. But this is what's going on. Thaddeus Stevens is basically dying on the Senate floor as this is happening, and he's a very corpse-like looking individual in the best of times. So this is from Wikipedia. The New York Herald described Stevens as having, quote, a face of corpse-like color, rigidly twitching lips, as a strange and unearthly apparition, a recluse remonstrance from the tomb, the very embodiment of fanaticism, without a solitary leaven of justice or mercy, the avenging nemesis of his party, the sworn and implacable foe of the executive of the nation, which sounds pretty fucking cool. But then there's this next bit. But he was increasingly ill, and he took little part in the impeachment trial, at which the leading House manager was Massachusetts Representative Benjamin Butler. During this time, Thaddeus Stevens nourished himself on the Senate floor with a mixture of raw eggs, terrapin, which I believe is just turtle, and port and brandy. If I had to guess why he might have been dying on the floor of Congress, it might have had something to do with drinking brandy, turtles, fucking port, and eggs. But, I'm not a doctor, so, don't take my advice on that. There are photos throughout this book. There are like little sections of photos, and you just look at these people and like, as like the white congressman, you just go, this was a different time, man. This was a different time. Very, very odd. But on a serious note, one thing that I guess we should note before we move on is that in the lead up to the Civil War and during the Civil War, some of the main people in the North who were pushing for abolition were obviously freed slaves. You had your people like Frederick Douglass and people, freedmen or people whose family had been freed. They sort of like black Northerners. But then you also had feminists, and there was this really interesting alliance leading up to Reconstruction between feminists and abolitionists. Obviously, it would have Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, people like that, but I don't know. I think that's just worth pausing on because Thaddeus Stevens kind of comes out of this milieu, right? And it's just a very interesting mix of, what would you say? I suppose like people who were maybe not in the best position in society getting together to really come forward for kind of common goals. And there's a really interesting mix of abolitionists and the suffragette movement, which is really fascinating and only touched on a little bit in this book, but really quite good. The alliance winds up falling apart, but still quite interesting.
Yeah, Foner does a good job of making a very obvious point, I suppose, which is throughout all of this period of time, the possibility of enfranchising women is totally overlooked. And it's, as you say, it's for the very reason that women's emancipation and women's receiving the right to vote in the US, it's the fact that that's constantly overlooked throughout this period of the liberation and the emancipation, temporarily, I suppose, of freed slaves. It's the fact that continues apace whilst there is nothing happens on women's emancipation that ultimately leads to the collapsing of that alliance. But it's an important thing that exists at this period of time that we're talking about now, kind of thing. And as you say, makes an important contribution to the history.
Yeah. And interesting also the way it kind of falls apart. But
yeah,
I suppose we've touched on the first of these, but we should also touch on the three kind of Reconstruction amendments, which was 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 13th was obviously abolition. It went on from the Emancipation Proclamation. The 14th was the right to citizenship for everybody born in the U.S., except, Dan, can you think of the one group that was excluded from that for all of this?
Yeah, it was. I spent a long time sort of trying to I mean, it's a similar thing. Like, how do you rationalize what's going on in these people's heads when they think about giving the former slaves the vote, but not women? But similarly, how do you rationalize not giving citizenship to everybody else but the native population of the land in which you're occupying?
Insane. It's so crazy. And it's like, these were the radicals of their time. It's like, we'll do the right thing and give the freed slaves the right to citizenship. And it's like, what about all of the people who were here before you. It's like, oh, that's an afterthought. No, of course not. Like, why would we even do that? It's fucking, there was not a single person, as far as I can tell, who was advocating for that.
Yeah, I think it's because their radicalism stems from a very particular type of ideology. And in some ways, a lot of the radicals and the people on the left of the Republican Party, when there are these debates about whether to give the former now emancipated and freed slaves the right to vote or not, there is a lot of difficulty even amongst radical circles to decide whether that's what they want or not. They certainly want to give a portion of equal rights to slaves, right? They want to make them free and equal citizens because they want them to be able to participate in this sort of like new burgeoning free labor economy. And they think that this is what's necessary to make that happen. But I don't know, but they then don't really extend that necessity to actually giving the right to vote. And that's what I mean by them having a very particular ideological outlook. They want to achieve a particular outcome. They have a particular concept of freedom, but also they have a particular concept of economic freedom, which underlies all of this. They have a particular concept of republicanism. And I think it's that it's not they're not motivated by a sort of like general humanism that you might then extend to Native Americans being allowed to survive, be like it, actually having to honor the agreements that you make with them and this kind of thing. They do want everybody. They do have an idea of what the right society. It's like because they are sort of like Enlightenment types. They're not quite liberals yet, but as a liberal formation will come into existence later on in this narrative. But like they do have a very particular type of Enlightenment ideology. They have an idea of civilization, and they have a very clear idea, I think, of what falls outside of that and what they're going to give no concern to. And in this case, it's the Native Americans, First Nations population.
Yeah, and it's just insane too, because it's like, we'll get on to the 15th Amendment here in a bit, but it's like, man, if the Republicans were to really follow through and give the freed slaves real citizenship and actually mean it, real civil rights and actually mean it, and actually give them the right to vote, in the immediate aftermath, they never would have lost a fucking election anywhere, right? Where there was like even something close to a majority black population. It's just like, but that just speaks to this dynamic between like, them wanting to end slavery, but also maintain a disciplined labor force and also win the elections. It's like, you kind of can't really have all three, because sooner or later they're going to, the slaves are going to kind of figure out what you were up to. But anyway, the last of the Reconstruction amendments was the 15th, and that was the one that ostensibly granted the right to vote for everybody. But again, he spends a time talking about this. I'm going to read another little bit. I apologize to the listener, but this is really important to get across, because he makes the point that this wasn't done for the reasons that we think it's done. He says that to kind of give some context to this, like most quote unquote radical bills that pass through the United States, it gets watered down to the point of basically meaning nothing. And the original amendment was going to be this really big sweeping thing where it's like you can vote regardless of I think the original wording was race. Yeah, he says here race, color, nativity, property, education, or religious beliefs. And then it was eventually basically just gotten down to race to basically just mean the freed slaves. And the reason for this is, as he says, the 15th Amendment was more remarkable for what it did not than for what it did contain. The failure to guarantee blacks' right to hold office arose from fear that such a provision would jeopardize the prospects of ratification in the North. Equally important, northern states wished to retain their own suffrage qualifications. In the West, the Chinese couldn't vote, and the 15th Amendment altered this situation. Noted California Republican Senator Cornelius Cole said that it would kill our party dead as stone. Pennsylvania demanded citizens to own $134 worth of real estate. Massachusetts and Connecticut insisted on literacy. Thus, the northern states during Reconstruction actually abridged the right to vote more extensively than the southern states. Ironically, it was not a limited commitment to blacks' rights, but the desire to retain inequalities affecting whites that produced a 15th Amendment that opened the door to poll taxes, literacy tests, and property qualifications, obviously, especially in the South. Oh my God, when I read that just fucking pissed me off so much. It's like, here we have this ostensibly progressive political party watering down their own amendments so that they can keep, people in like Rhode Island from voting. It's just insane. It's so insane. And just obviously, this is something that is fairly obvious. The treatment of the Chinese building the railroads, the Chinese immigrant population in specifically California, was just so brutal. And obviously you would have the Chinese Exclusion Acts and all sorts of stuff like this. But like, again, this was just another population of the United States that the ruling class realized if they actually followed through on giving them rights, it would mean, oh, fuck, nobody would actually vote for us anymore. So we can't do that. Just maddening.
Yeah, we want to give black Southern freed slaves the right to vote because they might advantage us, but we don't want to give poor white people the right to vote in Maine or wherever. Because
yeah, exactly.
But it does underlie the recognition that like these are tactical choices, and also it underlies a recognition of like developing class relationships in this whole process, and how like politics is an adjunct of maintaining class relationships. I think which of these amendments, this is another brief aside really, is I think Susan B. Anthony gets quite upset because one of these amendments is the first one that introduces the word men or man into the Constitution.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure.
It guarantees black men the right to vote,
Yeah.
which is I think it's one of the first sort of like nails in the coffin of this alliance that you were talking about before, as those two interests begin to diverge, kind of thing.
Yeah. And this just kind of shows, obviously, the slow watering down of Reconstruction, the slow abandonment of it, and then just the slow dissolution of the quote-unquote radical Republican caucus into just completely other things. I guess we should talk a little bit about the end of Reconstruction and about the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, which is particularly maddening.
One of the things I'd like to touch on just before that is another one of the ways in which the racism of the northern white Republicans really sort of revealed itself, but also it sort of like reveals a degree of ignorance on their part, is that one of the reasons that they were quite apprehensive about giving the right to vote and all of these extended freedoms to the freed slaves was they didn't think they were capable of using them. And one of the things that was revealed quite clearly by this history is that no, they could clearly participate in politics, and they joined the Republican Party en masse, and they also began all these sort of education societies and open schools, and began to go to university and these kind of things. There was this massive engagement with all of these new liberties. That's probably one of the most important legacies of Reconstruction, that was totally unexpected, I think, by northern whites, but it was so fundamental to this sort of like the late 1860s period, I suppose. And I guess one of the aspects which sort of led to a lot of the aspects of the reaction to that, particularly the reaction of whites and the degree of violence that was enacted on the freed slaves, the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, and that kind of thing. Obviously, there was a huge amount going on. But we've already alluded to the fact that there's a very complicated history, and there are so many different things. Oh, it's worth saying right now, as we go into the sort of latter phase of Reconstruction, there are a huge number of things that lead to the undermining of Reconstruction. One of them is the violence enacted by the Ku Klux Klan and other organizations like it, sort of avowedly white supremacist ones that would be crushed by very decisive action by the federal government. And one of the ways in which the federal government made it clear through Reconstruction that they were willing to intervene in the South in a lot of ways. Maybe they weren't willing to like get rid of the quote unquote traitors, maybe they weren't going to lead to an all-out class war against the planter class, but they were going to at least attempt to defend in some respects the rights of freed slaves to exercise these new rights that they've been given. But yeah, one of the things anyway. Yeah.
Well, yeah, fuck, I completely forgot. We haven't even talked about the Ku Klux Klan. God damn it. We're an hour and we haven't even talked about the KKK. What a particularly horrifying series of events that took place. I mean,
I find it very difficult.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. I remember growing up in school when we were learning about the Civil War, in one of my textbooks when I was a kid, there was an etching that's in this book that really fucked me up for a long time. And it's this It's a dramatization of the Ku Klux Klan, and what it is it's like a nice black family cooking food in their home, and there are these two hooded guys with guns like peeking into the house, and it's this really horrifying image. And he uses it in this book, and I was like kind of triggered again. I was like, oh fuck, this freaked me out when I was a kid, and it's freaking me out now. But just a really singularly horrifying series of events in United States history. And obviously you touched on it a bit there. The KKK operated to using violence, basically, not just against freed slaves and their families, but also against Republicans who came in to kind of administer things, like bureaucrats. They would go around murdering them. They'd go around murdering slaves, ex-slaves, I should say. And one of the things that really made me think about was like, you kind of hear this refrain a lot when there's violence perpetuated against a majority population in some areas by a minority group, a like radical terrorist group like the KKK. You kind of hear a lot like, well, why didn't they just fight back? They had more numbers. They could have easily just kicked their ass. To say nothing of like the fact that most farmers had guns, but they were like shotguns he mentions here, whereas the KKK was being given like fucking rifles and shit by the old plantation owners, or just were the plantation owner class. But I mean, he uses some primary sources here of freed slaves to kind of explain why that could never really have happened. And in some cases, obviously, it did. You had people protecting themselves and their families and kicking the KKK out before the federal government got its act together and really was like, okay, we need to stop this. But in reality, what would have happened is, say, and I think this did happen. I think he gives an example of like an Irish immigrant and a black family who kind of tried to take things into their own hands and go and oust some of these KKK pricks from their communities. Is they did, but then the broader white population would just buy into the propaganda and be like, see, look at these violent people, these violent savages. Okay, I understand why the KKK was doing what they did, and would just lead to a huge backlash. And so it's just this complete no-win situation for the slaves being terrorized by the KKK, where if they tried to do something, they would lose, and if they didn't, they would just be cowed into being sharecroppers who were forced to give up everything that they had, just like they had before the Civil War, before emancipation. So really just a brutal situation, and took really several years for the federal government to come in and actually quote unquote set things right. But like even after that, like the KKK's peak was in the 1920s. They had like almost 4 million members in the 20s, and that's when lynchings were at the highest and all, so it's like, yeah, I don't know. It's very brutal. And obviously it's still around. So, not great.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in some ways, like, he implies that they sort of like materially weren't in a similar position to fight back, as you say, from like being under resourced and not having the right weapons and that kind of thing, and also just lacked the same degree of social power. Right? He talks about the makeup of the Ku Klux Klan, and the people doing the direct violence may have been like the poor whites kind of thing, but there were so many people in the Ku Klux Klan that were also sheriffs or politicians or ministers or teachers or that kind of thing. It was he points out there is a false analysis, or it's in history. In former historical analysis of the Ku Klux Klan, there's been a sort of false image drawn of them being as just being ignorant whites kind of thing, but really it was an organization that sort of like existed in all stratas of Southern white society. And there's a sort of aside to that, which I'm not sure how well it connects, but he does also discuss the degree to which the Democrats in the South were willing to suppress people's ability to exercise their rights, partly through violence, I suppose, but also through various different efforts at like voter disenfranchisement, putting in place qualifications for voting. And he sort of says that the Northern Republicans were so committed to a sort of like democratic ideology that they weren't willing to go to the same degree of voter suppression. And maybe it wouldn't have been through direct violence, but it certainly would have been disenfranchising, as we said before, the planter class that they were unwilling to disenfranchise and that kind of thing. So there just seems to be this sort of like stark dichotomy between the Northern Republicans who weren't willing to engage in any type, form or other of voter disenfranchisement or prevention of participation in democracy, but the Democrats in the South were willing to do that. And it was interesting for me how it seems to be a legacy that's gone on continues to this day. Like you think of sort of like voter suppression either as being something that existed in the run up to the civil rights movement in the 60s, or it exists to a degree today. But it's all the same tactics that have been used for the past 100, what are we at now, 70 years, to prevent in some parts of the South anyway, the black population, the majority black population in some places, from having a degree of influence on politics that they would have done if they were just allowed to participate freely. So it's interesting to draw that legacy all the way through this, I guess.
Do you need an ID to vote out here? You do, don't you?
No, you don't.
Okay.
But there have been moves recently to try and implement a law like that. Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, great.
Oh, great.
I don't know how far that's come along, actually. Yeah, maybe it has passed, and maybe it will be in place by the next general election, that you need to have a form of ID. No. Yeah, there's just a similar furore has been kicked up over the possibility of voter fraud, even though there's absolutely no evidence of any form of voter fraud ever taking place. Yeah, I imagine it would probably be quite shocking to some people in some countries how easy, like, you don't even have to take a polling card to the booth here. You just go and say your name and where you live, and then they give you your ballot and physically cross your name off a list.
I'm going to force you to vote for the Lib Dems. I'm going to pretend to be a... Imagine.
You could go in like, and say your name is me.
Yeah, it's me. Is this like what Tories think? They're like, people are committing voter fraud to get Keir Starmer elected.
Yeah. It's also in a lot of rhetoric quite racialized.
Of course. Yeah. Great. All right. So Rutherford B. Hayes, should we talk about him? This guy, I believe he's called in this book a no-name political nobody. So the Republicans just wanted some schmuck that they could run, much like we more or less have a Warhammer 40,000 situation in the United States of just the corpse-like existence of Joe Biden as just being a guy that they put up there and who beat Trump, right? They kind of just wanted somebody like that. They wanted a Rutherford B. Hayes. I think he was the governor of Ohio or something like that. Anyway, the election becomes really closely contested. And there are 20 electoral, I think it's something like 20. There's something like 20 electoral college votes up for grabs. And there's after some shady backroom dealings, Rutherford B. Hayes is elected. And surprise, surprise, just, by pure coincidence, Reconstruction's ended and all the federal troops are taken out of the South. And it seems like, I don't know what sense you got, but it seems like that was a better deal for the Democrats, because who knows what Tilden would have been able to do if he was actually president, the Democrat who ran. But it seems like, at this point, the Radical Republican caucus or whatever had really disbanded. It was no longer really a title that anybody held to. Republican politicians had really lost interest in all of this sort of thing. There were the draft riots in New York City, which was one of the most violent goddamn riots in United States history, if not the most violent, which saw a lot of racial animosity in the North, in New York City, obviously. And so it seemed like Reconstruction was just going away. The last thing I'll say on it is that Foner really makes the point where he was like, you can't just be like, this was Rutherford B. Hayes' fault for ending Reconstruction. Because in American schools, that's, you learn like a couple of facts about each president, then you move on. The one that you learn about Rutherford B. Hayes is that he had like a big beard and that he ended Reconstruction. And like, that's it. But he's like, this didn't cause the end of Reconstruction. This was the culmination of the end of Reconstruction and just its period, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the structure of this book is very much formulated into different chapters on different both chronological periods of this history, but also concise topics. But there is a sense, basically at every point in this book, there are things hinted at that are undermining Reconstruction in various ways, all the way through this period. I say that just to emphasize what you say there. It's not Hayes's fault. It's not like Reconstruction is going really well and then they pull the plug on it. One of the things that's most important, I think, one of the things that I found most interesting anyway, is just the degree of shifting class relations, and then similarly the shifting relationships in a political ideology that were happening in the Democrats and the Republicans through this period. And it sort of speaks to how Northern Republicans felt about Reconstruction in the first place. And I think it does emphasize the ways in which it wasn't sort of like um, a humanist project, but it was a very pragmatic ideological one. And there was sort of this general coalescence of views that the I think what the picture that I got anyway was there was this sort of changing viewpoint among a lot of the elite in the North that although what they'd been intended to do was implement the sort of free labor ideology, or based on the free labor ideology, they wanted to implement a sort of free labor system into the South. What that had achieved was not a sort of flourishing of a free market capitalism that was their ideology, but rather what it had achieved was this kind of like degree of government bloat, this amount of necessity to tax and to spend, this necessity to intervene in the South so thoroughly. So I think they just seemed to be the image that I got anyway was there was this just general weariness with the whole project, and then this sense that actually their commitment to it was sort of tenuous and only partial, and so just it led to this realignment. The radical faction, as you say, kind of disappeared. Some of the moderate Republicans went over to supporting the Democrats. A lot of them started to shift to adopting a more classically liberal ideology, which wanted to see less taxation and all the things you sort of think of as being capitalist ideology 101, I guess. And so just the desires of the political class had moved on in the wake of the economic crisis of the early 1870s. There were other concerns. But as you say, it just seemed like a bit of a stitch up where in the end, what happened was Hayes comes in and adopts this policy of self-rule, I think is what he describes it. So it's not as if like there had been an erosion of some of the things implemented by Reconstruction, but it wasn't so much putting a firm end to it so much as withdrawing federal intervention in the South, and sort of then the South gradually over a sort of 20-year period, I suppose, slipped back into or started to implement things that they'd wanted to implement all the way through, means to discipline the black workforce, but the entire workforce, and also started to implement voter suppression again. So it felt to me more like a fizzling out than a sort of like hard end. Is that a fair portrayal, do you think?
I think so. And especially he talks about this rise of what he calls the new liberal ideology, right?
Mm.
And this comes purely out of the burgeoning industrial capitalist class in the North, as not necessarily having their interests in the agrarian expansion of the South. And cotton for a long time had been falling in price and falling in demand on the world market. And so increasingly, the loudest voices in the Republican Party were representing their real constituents, who were the burgeoning capitalist class of the North, right? And I think a lot of these people saw their main goal. This was like reformers, right? They saw the main goal as civil service reform in the North, right? Which is like fair. Like you had people like Boss Tweed in the North and just this pure patronage system. The reformers really wanted ostensibly a meritocracy, right? They wanted an end to protective tariffs. And I think that they really felt that the old radical Republicans were constantly, as they called it, waving the bloody shirt of the Civil War, by being like, don't you remember how many people died in the Civil War? Don't you remember how horrible this all was? Don't you remember how bad the South was? And this political class of reformers, this burgeoning liberal group, was just getting weary of it. And increasingly, and also this was really fascinating, we start to see the seeds of a real industrial labor movement, and that takes the capitalist class's interest. They go, whoa, this is way more important, putting out these fires than doing civil rights in the South and allowing this class to not just fall back into sharecropping and slavery in all but name. There was a massive strike in 1877 that coincided with the election and trying to sort out the election, in which the monumental decision that Rutherford B. Hayes eventually made to send in the army to quell the strikes, which basically stopped railroads. Railroad buildings were burned down, tracks were dug up, this type of thing. This really led to a growing faction in the Republican Party being like, we really need to focus on beating down this new industrial proletariat, because this is where our real economic interests are, and not so much, quote unquote, like waving the bloody flag of the South. So that doesn't show you what politics is. I don't know what is.
And it's pointed out in this book. It's a recognized hypocrisy at the time that for Hayes to be inaugurated in sometime in the March of 1877, withdraw federal troops from the South and lead to this sort of like home rule in the South or whatever they call it, because it's not the federal government's job to be the country's policeman. And then a few months later, there's this massive strike, and what does he do? He uses federal troops to break up.
God damn
it. Turns out maybe it is the federal government's job to intervene in certain places where it's necessary,
where their bread is buttered.
Yeah, exactly. Which just enforces what you were just saying, that they decided their priorities had changed.
Yeah, grim story, and that's the end of Reconstruction. and it once the lesson is that once the federal government leaves, and the freed slaves and the Black Americans in the South, they still don't have proper universal suffrage. They still don't have proper citizenship. They still don't have proper civil rights. They're the Black Codes. We'll go into the Jim Crow era eventually, right? Like, once the federal government leaves, it's just, new boss, same as the old boss, because they can't help themselves, because they no longer have a stake in political rule, and they're just being ruled over again. And so, basically, we wanted to read this book to kind of try and answer the question of what does it mean when different socialist groups say we need to finish Reconstruction. And I think a whole lot of, more history needs to be read to understand what happened between 1877 and, 2023. But universal suffrage is still not a thing. And the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, except for the ones that are in prisons, right? And still to this day, you can still do slavery as long as they're in prison, right? And so real universal suffrage, real universal citizenship, a real stake in, one person, one vote. These might be things that point towards, I think, finishing Reconstruction.
He does. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. He does sort of like, I'm just trying to draw on what he thinks of the legacy of Reconstruction is. And he points, I don't know how, he points on a few factors that came out of it. He talks about the strengthening of the Black family. I'm not quite sure what he means by that necessarily, but also this legacy of both the significance of the church and the significance of education as being three legacies which kind of persist and really do actually feed into the civil rights movement nearly 100 years later, of being these sort of like legacies that survive. But then he also finishes the book with this discussion of how that history was passed on, because general historical analysis of the period often saw it as a failure and as something that should never have been attempted. And he talks about how it was only in the sort of like in the memory of the emancipated slaves that lived through that period, that they sort of like the true history of that period, the significance of that period, what was attempted, lived on, kind of thing. And he sort of ends with this idea that it was significant. What the question is almost like not why did it fail, but it was incredibly significant that it was ever attempted in the first place. Like, why was it attempted then, and what circumstances?
It was more optimistic the end than I thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Because I thought he was going to come down and be like, see, this fucking sucked and it failed. But he's kind of also just like, yes, we're still feeling the reconstruction of this abject failure in many ways today. But also it's remarkable that it even happened at all, Mm-hmm. There are a couple little things we didn't touch on that kind of blew my mind. One was he gives the number of Blacks serving in the Union Army. And I had always just kind of assumed, okay, it was probably just like a couple people that made their way north, or, the minority population that lived in the north. But he puts the number at 180,000 people, which is insane. And does go to show that, yes, Lincoln had an interest in the Emancipation Proclamation, also because he wanted to win the war, and he knew that a lot of people more would fight for it. And also we didn't touch on the Union Leagues, which were like these kind of extra governmental, extra state structures that formed sometimes in secret, sometimes in not, sometimes just with radical Republicans in the South, sometimes, and I would say most of the time, with freed slaves. These groups that were kind of like half mutual aid, half political groups, to kind of organize Black life and Republican life in the post-war South. he tells a really cool anecdote about how at all of these meetings they would have, I think, like a flag and a Bible, which, like, whatever, on the table, who cares? But that they would also have some kind of instrument of labor on the table. And oftentimes it was like an anvil or, a carpenter's tools or something like that, to really be like, here are the things that we're here for. And I thought that was fucking cool. I was like, damn, okay, this was the most radical class. This is very, very cool. Is there anything else? Anything else we need to talk about?
I think other than to emphasize how fully these rights were taken up, how much enthusiasm there was for them, how much participation there was in all of these different organizations, as you say. Other than that, I think I think what I would say is there's a huge amount in this book, far more than we could cover in this discussion, and it's definitely worth reading. Because it's just a very sort of very consumable but very comprehensive history, and you can't sort of quite grasp it without going through the full narrative, because there's so many interlocking elements, which almost sort of it seems like the picture that I'm taking away is that it was such a rupture happened, not just in like American politics, but sort of also American economics at the time. That allowed for this peculiar flourishing before everything settled back into almost the way it had been before, kind of thing. But it's interesting what can be opened, and in some ways, this is why he refers it refers to it as a revolutionary moment, right? So many things were thrown into question, so many new options were put in the air. There was so much possibility that it almost looks from him looking back, it almost seems like an impossibility. Why did it happen at all? And it was because it was almost a revolutionary moment that failed. It was a failed revolution.
Yeah. And I mean, we didn't, another thing we didn't even touch on was the idea of chain gang labor, which was just an immediate return to slavery, in which the state governments in the South would just loan out chain gangs, loan out labor to different capitalists or to the state itself. And this, we'd see all sorts of laws in the South being put into place where it's like, you stole a pig, 5,000 years in prison for that, right? Just these over the top laws where if you did anything wrong and you were black, you'd be put into the chain gangs. And that obviously would last well into the 20th century. And well, I mean, we don't have literal chain gangs now, but we still do have a lot of prison labor. And so that still lasts. One thing, I'm going to read one more thing, Dan, unfortunately. And this one's from Black Reconstruction in America. I poked through the last chapter of Du Bois? I never know how to say it. His book, the tome, the one that you should read. And I found these two paragraphs, and I think there's something we should think about if we're trying to do historical materialism. So he says, if one reads, for instance, Charles and Mary Beard's Rise of American Civilization with a comfortable feeling that nothing right or wrong could ever be involved, when he's talking about history here. Manufacturing and industry develop in the North, agrarian feudalism develops in the South. They clash as winds and waters strive, and the stronger forces develop the industrial machine that governs us so magnificently and selfishly today. Yet in this sweeping mechanistic interpretation, there's no room for the real plot of the story, for the clear mistake and guilt of rebuilding a new slavery of the working class in the midst of a fateful experiment in democracy, for the triumph of sheer moral courage and sacrifice in the abolition crusade, and for the hurt and struggle of the degraded black millions in their fight for freedom in their attempt to enter democracy. Can all of this be omitted or half suppressed in a treatise that calls itself scientific? I think, heavy words, very, very heavy words. And I think a very stark reminder of, not just the human cost of history, but also he's really clearly making a point here. He's like, if you want to be scientific about history, if you want to do dialectical materialism or whatever, you goddamn nerds, you really have to understand the concrete, because if you don't, you're not going to understand the true nature of these monumental historic events. And it's just going to lead you to do what he says here, where, you have the interpretation that it was capitalists versus the old feudal aristocracy in the South. And that's just clearly not what it was. And it takes away from the individual action of millions of people going throughout their daily lives. And particularly brutal. And unfortunately, this episode doesn't really have a happy ending, because this is still where we're at today. So I would echo your call. I think that people should read this book. This is his short history of Reconstruction. We did not read his actual history of Reconstruction. It kind of got me to think, remember in the Communal when he was like, if you actually want to understand historical periods, you have to kind of do capital, but for the period of your choice. I think that one of these days, maybe we get around to reading Black Reconstruction in America or Foner's bigger book on the subject, because I think if there's a situation or a period of history in American history that could necessitate that level of analysis, it's definitely Reconstruction, and did not happen that long ago too. Something we haven't mentioned. So yeah, not great, but good stuff to read. It's weirdly enough, even though the phrase dialectical materialism or historical materialism hasn't been mentioned at all in this book, it's definitely a work that is very materialist and has taught me quite a bit about how you do history or whatever.
He does talk about the dialectic of continuity and change at one point.
That's true. Which we like around here.
Which we like. We definitely like. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Well, yeah, everybody read this book. It's some good stuff. It's history that we read that isn't about the origin of capitalism. So, it's worth reading because, that's usually what we do around here. So we'll be back again with something very good. This has been a very long episode, but I think it was worth it. Hopefully you stuck around. And we'll see you some other time. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Jack. I've enjoyed this thoroughly. I'm really glad we finally got around to talking this book because it's a period of history I didn't know anything about, and I'm very glad we've now gone through it at least partially. It gives me a lot to think about, and I hope people listening have enjoyed it too. Thank you, everyone.
See ya. The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you like what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.